According to Market Watch report, Black hair care is a $2.5 billion industry. Yet McKinsey Marketing says most Black consumers feel their needs are not being met and that we are more likely to be dissatisfied than non Black consumers. Now, that has led to several initiatives to incorporate data science to have a more predictive model to help us with our hair care needs. On our last chat, we were here with Winnie Awa, and we talked about the use of technology to meet our hair goals and the need to have data balanced with informed hair professionals who will personalize recommendations. And we talked about the lack of support for those with tighter curl patterns. We're also hoping to talk about the need of collaboration, the implications of cosmetic regulations, but we ran out of time. So she graciously agreed to come back, and we will be continuing our conversation during today's chat. My name is Dr. Crystal Porter, and I'm a hair scientist and owner of Main Insights, a company that conducts research and focuses on the hair needs of people from African descent. This platform is designed to elevate the Black hair care industry and empower consumers and hair professionals with education that talks about scientific research and matters that pertain to our unique hair needs and culture. I appreciate you joining us for today's chat. Now, before I bring Winnie on, I would love for you to let me know who's out there with me this morning. Let me know who you are and where you're from by putting it in the chat. Also, let me know what type of watcher you are. If you are a consumer, put the number one. If you are, a practitioner, let's keep it consistent. A practitioner, put the number one. If you are a consumer, put the number two. And if you are a researcher or a scientist like me, put the number three. And also, please feel free to like and share this broadcast. I am sure there are others who will benefit from the information. Now, if you are frustrated with the lack of information available to you when it comes to caring for your hair, or you've wasted a lot of money, time, and resources trying to figure things out on your own, then you are definitely in the right place. And that is why we created the Our Black Hair Matters movement. Now, if you haven't checked it out already, I invite you to look at some of the resources that I have on my hair assets page, and I'll bring that up. And you'll find resources such as the biggest mistakes that curlies make. I have something about finding the right stylist. There are hair themed children's books for those of you who want to educate your young ones. And then I also have a template for you to write letters to companies just to see if they have data to back up their claims. Also, you can schedule a complimentary consultation by going to that particular link. All right. Now, some of you may have just joined, and so I'm going to take some time to reset. Welcome to the Our Black Hair Matters Lunchtime Chat. I am Dr. Crystal Porter, and this is part two of creating a world vision for the science of Black hair. We started a conversation last week about how data science can be used to improve Black hair care. And now we're going to continue to talk about collaboration, regulation, and what it means for Black hair. So I am welcoming Winnie Awa back. Let's bring her on. Hey there.
Hello. Hey, how are you? We
I'm
meet again.
good. Yeah, it's great to see you again. We had a lot of talking to do, which is awesome. Love
We did.
talking about Black hair with someone who is just as passionate as I am. So thank you so much for taking time out to come back again.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed the first part to our conversation.
Mm,
It's evident that neither of us can shut about talking about hair,
that's true.
inclusivity in hair, and innovation in hair care. So it's really
Yeah.
great to be back. And hello to everyone who's joining the broadcast as well.
All right. So, as before, I just want to give our viewers just background to who you are and where you're from. So, we have Winnie Awa. She is founder and CEO of Kara, and Kara is a AI-driven hair care personalization platform bringing together the power of science, data, and community to transform the textured hair care experience. With over 10 million data points on real-life consumer behavior and forward-looking trends, Cara Labs, its proprietary and award-winning textured hair engine, helps hair care brands, cosmetic formulators, and marketers creating game-changing, inclusive products that are informed by data. Winnie has over 12 years experience building innovative consumer tech platforms for world-renowned companies like Net-a-Porter, ASOS, LVMH, and EY. After seeing firsthand how the textured hair consumer was not being served, she was determined to make a change, and she has initially launched cult platforms um, at Antidote Street. And then in running this, she had a front row seat to the biggest challenges facing consumers with textured hair, and thus Cara was born. And so she is the recipient of the Women in Innovation UK grant, shortlisted for the Sunday Times Beauty Distributor Award, and a regular Glamour Beauty Power List and Women's Health Judge.
Thank you.
Awesome. Congrats on doing so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. So we are going to just dive right back into it because we were talking about the article that was written in Allure about the rise of cosmetic chemists. And we started talking about the need for collaboration. And so in Allure, it was really interesting because they were talking about how in cosmetic science, there is not a real definition of what a cosmetic scientist is. And from a cosmetic chemist standpoint, it is almost scary. And this is going to feed into the conversation that we're going to have about regulations. Because if you don't standardize who a cosmetic chemist is or what it is, then how can you safeguard against formulations that may be made that could be made by someone who just isn't educated enough to know the safety precautions that need to be taken? And so there has been a rise in the number of hair practitioners who formulate their own products. They're mixing things in the back room, coming out, not letting you see what it is, and not really telling you because it's secret. And so I'm just wondering that's how things are evolving here. I'm curious about how things are evolving with professionals there in the UK and how consumers are responding to it.
I would say that there was certainly a time, probably about 5 to maybe perhaps 8 years ago, when certainly when we looked at the hair care industry, at that point, we often would look to the US for access to products for our hair. And the availability of products that existed were typically small mom and pop shops, people formulating natural products in their sorts of kitchens and then selling it typically at hair care fairs or really any type of fairs that you might see. So there you might get your whipped up shea butter or something along those lines. But they were typically DIY products that were formulated, natural products, often really good. But I think maybe perhaps the slight difference is that they weren't necessarily products that were being sold at, from a mass perspective. They were artisanal products. The same way you could go somewhere to a little Sunday market and pick up a nice body butter. It was a bit similar to that. But what we're seeing certainly within the UK is a rise in independent brands that are actually spending the time in the formulation of the brand, basically the totality, I would say, of the hair care brand, everything from the actual formulation through to the branding of the product itself before it hits the shelves. And I do remember certainly with my experience of running Antidote Street, my first company, it was really interesting to see when US customers then started wanting UK originated brands. And I think that's a really interesting segue to the conversation I know we're going to have around perhaps regulations that exist. So within the EU, we know widely within the beauty industry that the EU actually restricts somewhere around 1,300 to 1,500 ingredients that are essentially banned ingredients that you can't utilize in your beauty formulation, full stop. Whereas historically, FDA has always restricted a very small amount. I think it's in the double digits. I can't remember the actual number. Don't quote me. But it was typically in the double digits in terms of what it was that the FDA restricted. And I think what was fascinating and certainly coincided with the trend that we started to see where our US based customers became interested in UK originated product roughly around the same time that the clean beauty movement was coinciding with the natural hair movement. So people started becoming perhaps more aware that products perhaps originating from EU were had a better, tighter control around the ingredients that were being utilized. So I thought that that was an interesting, maybe, way in which movements coincided with consumer desires, and also at the same time the growth of perhaps a nascent industry within a particular market. I just thought that that was interesting looking at it from that point of view because we had that view to be able to see, okay, this is what's happening now from a consumer perspective. This is what's happening from a just wider macroeconomic view. And this is actually what's happening from a regulations perspective. It's just really, really interesting to me.
That is fascinating. And I understand the need or the desire for consumers to want to have a product that has tighter controls over ingredients that could be, uh, I guess, I don't want to say not all of them have adverse reactions. However, it depends on the level of research that has been done on them. And
Yeah.
sometimes, if there is a chance that it may have some type of negative impact, then they're like, we're not going to take a chance. And I like that approach.
Yes.
And here in the US, I think we are a little bit less conservative. And with the with the research coming out saying that our environment really plays a role in our health, we are just scratching the surface to really understand how things like ingredients can impact us. And I know I don't want to be a scaremonger, but one thing that concerns me is we're just learning a whole lot more. I think technology is becoming more sensitive in terms of the instruments that can measure how things impact our health. And I think as we learn more, we need to be a little bit more cautious, but not overly cautious. Because if there is a history of things being okay, then I think things are probably okay. My concern
Yeah.
is when people are coming up with all these new ingredients that aren't properly tested, or you're combining several ingredients that can have a reaction or it can change the composition because of how they're in mixed with one another, how that can have implications. And without proper testing, that is what scares me. And you mentioned during our last conversation that there are so many smaller companies out there that are selling products and without having these regulations or controls, because unfortunately now there is no pre-market approval, at least here in the United States. There's none, and it's based on the honor system. And I was really surprised when I came outside of corporate America and started just interacting and talking to a lot of small business owners. I was surprised that they did not go through making sure that their product was safe. They did not do bacterial testing. They did not do stability testing. And I was just like, oh my God. I mean, to me, that is formulation 101 when it comes to putting something on the market. And the thing is, I don't think that people were intentionally not doing it. They just didn't know that that was something that was a thing. They didn't think that they needed to.
I think that, look, like, I think sometimes these things are really as a direct response to what it is that we're seeing within the industry, right? So why are people in their kitchen creating products? It's because we don't have products that are catering to us. It's as simple as that. I have a friend, to share this anecdotally. She at one point confided in me that actually she really just does not trust any conditioner she buys. So whenever she buys a conditioner, she would proceed to add her own ingredients to the conditioner in order to achieve certain requirements. That's crazy because, of course, doing that from a consumer perspective, it basically says my concerns are not being met. I'm going to alter this formulation so that I can get to a better, maybe perhaps formulation that I believe my hair needs. Maybe it's because I don't feel like it's moisturizing my hair enough. So maybe I'm going to add some natural ingredients into that formulation to give me the feeling or to genuinely potentially reach a better formulation. So people have been known to reach interesting surprise formulations off the back of that approach. The challenge that you have with that, unfortunately, is that if you're taking a product that may or may not have been stability tested, and then you're adding some new sort of some new quantities, new entities into the mix, it potentially throws off anything that has been tested in that product. It potentially introduces interesting challenges. I just think that this really just does highlight the lack that exists in the industry. The reason why we're creating products in our kitchen, we're looking for alternatives, is because our needs are not being met. So you're absolutely right that I don't think people are doing this intentionally. They're really just trying to fill a need. And we often have to ask ourselves, what is that telling us? And what that's telling us is that a gap still exists. I don't even think that it's a proof of the brands. You know, we're seeing it with larger companies who presumably can formulate products, and if it's not following any particular process in the UK, the EU cosmetic regulation stipulates that if you're going to formulate a beauty product for body, hair, skin, whatever, you have to follow very, very specific requirements in order to do that. So I think obviously there's a new law that's been introduced in the States called MOCRA. Can I remember what Modernization of Cosmetics Act or something along those lines?
Yes, that's right. Modernization Cosmetic Regulation Act. Yep.
Okay, so from what I understand, essentially that's going to increase the number of ingredients that are banned. So maybe we're going to get to a point where we start to see perhaps a bit of a similarity between the level of controls that we have within the EU to the levels of controls that we have within the US. And I generally think that that's a good thing to get to the point where we're paying maybe perhaps a better better attention to what it is that is entering into our bodies, to our hair. I think that that's a good thing, especially when you consider the fact that majority of the products that we're using are actually coming from the States, whether we like it or not just in the UK, across the African continent, Middle East. A huge proportion of the most popular products for hair care are coming from the States. So I do welcome the change, but of course there are always nitty gritties attached to each of these legislative regulations.
Yeah, and so I have mixed feelings. I was having a conversation about a week ago about how there is what the person I was talking to called a catch-22. And the catch-22 is, yes, it's great that regulations exist and are being modified. The issue is with Black products in particular. And as you said, there are a lot of people mixing things up themselves. And to qualify it as a small business to be exempt from some of the requirements that they have, you have to have less than $1 million in sales. So here in the United States, I mean, it's a huge country. And so what I have found is that there are products that are regional, meaning that here in the Midwest where I am, there are products being sold that no one has ever heard of in New York or California. But they're probably really close to that $1 million mark, if not reaching that $1 million mark. And so I have personally spoken to people who just haven't done their due diligence, but at the same time, you want a small business. I mean, I'm a small business. And so I want them to be given the chance to develop and to make sure that they are holding bigger brands' feet to the fire, basically, in terms of innovation and, as you said, those unmet needs. At the same time, I want our consumers to be safe. And a lot of times we do want to support Black businesses or smaller businesses or local businesses. And so sometimes I think our heart is in the right place, but if cosmetic companies or people who are formulating or coming up with concoctions don't have a standard that they have to meet in order to make sure that their products are out there, that is the issue to me, because I think there's more of a chance of something not being right when it's smaller. And so if they are exempt from a lot of the regulations, then it really isn't serving a purpose for us in terms of having safe products. So it really is a balancing act to make sure that some of the milestones that make a product safe is achievable from a smaller brand. That is the issue. And it's a huge opportunity, and one that I have started to become more involved in helping smaller businesses to get the data and the testing that they need at a smaller cost or a lower cost
Okay.
compared to what a lot of the bigger brands easily have access to.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is a challenge in terms of what it's going to mean from a cost perspective for smaller businesses, without doubt. Again, in the early days of Antidote Street, when we had first launched, I remember us wanting to bring in brands from the States that we heard about. We heard they were amazing brands. All the bloggers were talking about them. We really wanted to bring them to the UK. And those brands were reluctant to come into the EU. The cost of reformulating their products in line with the EU cosmetic regulation was just prohibitive for them. And they just didn't see a need to do that, or they didn't have the ability to afford that. So I do think that these regulations need to take into consideration the smaller businesses to try and understand, as you say, what are the right milestones to essentially support them within their business? What does it look like? But I also hope that spurs on. I think sometimes regulations also spurs on, other improvements in the industry. Maybe it's going to lead to more providers, such as like you, who are able to provide access to easier testing for startup companies.
Exactly.
Maybe that's a great thing, because at the end of the day, safety, as you say, is super important. But we just need to make sure that when we're talking about these things, we're actually talking about genuinely ingredients that actually would be used in beauty, because sometimes when we talk about banned ingredients, they might be ingredients that would actually never be used in beauty. But we speak about it from a blanket perspective, and we're like, that's a banned ingredient. But it's like, okay, well, no one is even using it in the first place. So it's so we really need to get into the detail of what constitutes a banned ingredient. What is the current trend in the cosmetic formulation industry? Is anyone actually utilizing that ingredient? What are the rights? And I think this kind of cuts across to the marketing around ingredients, right? What are the right quantities? What is the right context within which some of these ingredients are used? When I speak to cosmetics formulators, they often are quite concerned with the way clean beauty is marketed within the industry. Quite often we say this is clean, it's free from XYZ. But cosmetic formulators are arguing that actually within our practice, we know that this ingredient in X quantities are actually okay. So it's sort of, I think we're going to look at it from a 360-degree perspective. What are the right ingredients to be utilizing for formulation that are safe for us as consumers? And at the same time, what is the right context? How should we be communicating around the ingredients so as not to scare people, so that we have the right information?
Right.
And I mean, within this conversation, we of course have to talk about the growing body of research that we're seeing that speak about how many products targeted towards Black consumers are known to be toxic, and typically are now seen to have issues that impact endocrine systems. I believe there are people who are suing at the moment who believe that their products might have led to uterine cancer. That for me presents a whole world where I have a big, massive question mark, and I'm asking who is studying these things? How can
Mm,
we get a better understanding, right? Of what these products are, what are included in these products, whether the quantities that we're talking about are safe or not safe. I just think that I always think of it from a consumer perspective. How can we better communicate it so that us as consumers are like, okay, all right, this is actually what this means for us in our day to day lives. And we're not going to wake up 20 years later to be like, oh, you know, that product you used that time, that's now giving you cancer or something along those lines. Um, I just think that there needs to be that more needs to be done within that space. And there are also very interesting studies around triple C, triple C. I can never say the full word. Triple C alopecia, where we're seeing or interesting studies are coming up that are linking triple CA, which is typically predominantly most common within Black women, and we're seeing linkages between that and fibroids. That's also another big question. How are we studying the links between these perhaps hormonal or autoimmune conditions? And yeah, what are we doing about that? Where are the studies around that? And what does that mean for us when it comes to personal care, essentially?
agree 100%. And what I am really interested in is I know that we have access to more data now. And traditionally, here in the United States, a lot of Black people are just non trusting. So they don't participate in studies.
Okay.
So I think we are gradually starting to open our eyes to understand the need for us to be represented in different studies, such as what you described in terms of what's needed. But I would be interested to know, is there an increase the what they're saying? It seems like there is a growing trend or a growing predominance of what you're calling triple CA. I haven't heard it called that before, but yeah, it is central centrifugal cicatricial alopecia.
That's the one.
Yeah, yeah. And so there does seem to be an epidemic and a rise in that particular type of alopecia in women of African descent. And I'm curious because there are changes in our environment, which is what I alluded to earlier. I think that some of our life, our culture, our lifestyle can dictate our health and how our body is able to fend off certain types of diseases. And I think as we are evolving, I think our body may not be evolving at the same rate to be able to withstand some of the things that we do to it or the lack of nutrition that we have. I mean, so there are so many variables. And that's what makes this research more difficult. And so when I say that I don't want to make it seem like we all need to be on pins and needles and overly concerned, I do want us to be aware that there are things that we do in our life that can affect how our body responds to certain external stimuli or products or activities or whatever. And so, without us really knowing, it's really difficult for us to truly understand what the impact is going to be because we're not all going to be impacted the same way. And one thing that people say, and I just kind of cringe every time I hear it, is, oh, I don't introduce anything to my body unless it's natural. You know, if I can't eat it, I don't use it. And that's not always the answer either, because not everyone can even withstand certain natural products. There are essential oils that I'm allergic to. My body just does not respond well to it. And so that's not always the answer either. And so when we talk about personalization and getting data and information so that we can understand why things are occurring and so that we can better have a predictive model for individuals, that is really where the power is and where I think we need to go for everyone to not only understand their bodies, but to also have the compatibility that's needed for them to have their best selves.
Absolutely. I mean, to your point around nutrition, I think maybe perhaps one of the positives of going through COVID was that we realized that the importance of vitamin D in the immune system of melanated people. And
Mhm.
we know that vitamin D is something that is super, super crucial for not just your immune system, but also really your hair, right?
Mhm.
So these are things that are opening our eyes to how we ought to be supplementing ourselves, or how we need to kind of look after our immune system, our nutrition. I was speaking to a trichologist in our podcast, and it was really, really fascinating because he drew the distinction between biotin. So, whereas in the industry, everybody talks about biotin as a big deal for hair care, everybody utilizes biotin in their hair care products, in their supplements. But actually, from his perspective, it's very extremely rare to find people who are deficient in biotin. Like, something would have had to gone fundamentally wrong, because we produce biotin. Biotin is in a lot of the food sources that we consume. Where actually the things that we need to be concerned about are things like iron and B12, and advocating for having our bloods done so that we can understand what our levels are, so that we can eat appropriately or supplement appropriately, as opposed to just taking all the supplements and then peeing them out. So
Exactly.
there's that element as well. So I think actually this is why, to go back to the point around cosmetic scientists or chemists coming to the fore, this is why it's actually really important, and it makes for a very interesting conversation, because they're bringing the science to the conversation. They're helping us understand in a way that is digestible for the average consumer who wants to have health, who wants to have perhaps good skin, good hair care, etc. So I think that those are really good developments that we're certainly seeing within the industry. And with you on not creating scare tactics, again, this is where education to dispel myths, to dispel misinformation, absolutely comes into it as well. Um, I really understand the sort of apprehension around utilizing products that are not natural, because history has taught us that when we've utilized products that are not natural, it's just not really served us well. I completely get the psychology of that. I really get it. Of course, if you've seen studies that are conducted by big, credible, well-respected institutions such as the National Institute of Health or Harvard School of Public Health, of course you're going to be worried. So I think the next steps is to really try to start to contextualize a lot of the studies we're seeing, try to have more studies for areas where we need more information, and then wrapping that up in a easily digestible topics for us to consume, and make sense of what that means for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm looking down because there's something that you hit on that I want to talk about with MOCRA, which is the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act. And there is something that I think is worthwhile talking about, because you were talking about the lawsuits that are going on. And I want to have a disclaimer that I am not an attorney. And everything that I am going to talk about is based on, food for thought, I'll say. Not to say that it's giving power to one side or the other, but these are things that I think we need to talk about. So with MOCRA, there is something that they are emphasizing, which I am glad they're emphasizing, because before, well, I think it's to the end of this year when things really are jumping off, and you have to be compliant with certain aspects of these new regulations. But the serious adverse event. So in the past, there was no mechanism for anyone other than contacting the company to report that there was an adverse event. And even if they reported it, the FDA didn't need to know about it, or no other governing body needed to know about it. And so now it needs to be reported within 15 days of
Yeah.
someone complaining, which I think is great. But what I'm really curious about are the relaxers, because even though they say the intended use, and so, following directions and making sure that you have very clear instructions on how the product is intended to be used. And I'm wondering, because consumers, when it comes to relaxers, I know so many people who do not follow the directions. They apply it the way that they want to apply it. But then, if they're going to have an adverse reaction, they're going to report it. But who is the one who's going to be able to tell if they used it as intended? So I'm real curious about what's going to happen with relaxers and what the larger companies who sell them, what they're going to do. Because if you have to report adverse reactions within 15 days, and I can just imagine how many people are going to have a reaction, whether or not they misused it or not. Because some people, just by nature, are more sensitive to certain products, particularly the caustic product of a relaxer. So I'm real curious about how that's going to impact the industry and what companies are going to do. Is it only going to be a professional product? And even if it is only a professional product, I also know professionals who don't do what they should do anyway. So, I mean, it just seems like a big mess waiting to happen. And I am curious about how all of this is going to unfold.
I mean, this is really, really fascinating because I was so curious to learn that whenever a big massive beauty conglomerate does a recall of a product from shelves, actually it's not the FDA that's mandating it. Typically they're doing it just from a voluntary perspective. And
That's
I
true.
think what it is that this law introduces is in an event that happens, what's interesting is that FDA can actually finally now mandate and say, hey, Mr. Brand A over there, there's an adverse reaction happening with your leave-in conditioner. We need to pull it from all the shelves, regionally or nationally or wherever. I think that that's so fascinating because if we were to compare and contrast that to the EU, typically you're following a set of standards. Typically you're appointing an EU responsible person, and it's the responsibility of your responsible person to report these scenarios and make sure that the necessary steps are taken. Now, in terms of how it actually works out on our day-to-day life, I don't actually know. Like, you don't see it in terms of your day-to-day life. I can't really recall a time where I'm like, oh my God, that product's been recalled in the shop here in EU, right? So it's interesting to understand how these laws translate into our day-to-day lives. And to your point around relaxers, it's a fascinating one, and I really don't know the answer to that. Being quite honest. The other thing that I'm also thinking is we don't even know what the long-term effects of relaxers are. So is 15 days enough without appropriate studies to actually really understand the impact of relaxers on our bodies? Um, do we know? Are 15 days and how, like, I these are just questions in my mind. And which I feel I don't have the answers to them, in terms of what it actually means. Of course you can apply the same sort of reasoning as to whether people are following the intended use for certain products, right? We all know that some people might utilize a deep conditioner that is meant to be washed off, but actually they leave it in their hair for 5 hours.
Absolutely.
So it's really, really fascinating. It would actually be great to have, a formulator in this call, to hear what their thoughts are, because where are a natural question that has popped up to me is, where, when you're testing, where are the boundaries of our testing? So, for instance, when you have, I don't know, tomatoes in your fridge, it says best before date 20th of May, but actually you might be able to eat it on the 21st of May or 22nd or 23rd of May, and it's okay. So it's like, where is the real window and what is being communicated? It's such a complicated topic to unpack. But I definitely do think starting with understanding what ingredients are unsafe, have been tested to be unsafe, what are those ingredients and how do we make sure that they're not making their way into our product is probably a good place to start.
So it's interesting you talk about determining what products are unsafe, because the issue is this, and I have spoken about this in several forums, but my issue is when you have a population that is using the product, and that population is not well represented in the studies that you're doing or the sale. So if you're doing in vitro studies, which means that you're doing in a petri dish more or less, and under very controlled environments, and you're seeing the reaction of the cells to this particular product. Is the cell, or are the cells that you're using representative of the cells that will actually be introduced to the product in real life? And you have so many variables when it comes to lifestyle. So if you do a clinical study and you're not necessarily using participants that are representative of the population who is using the product, then you don't have a complete understanding of what is safe or not, because the results may be a little skewed because can be external factors that could impact your results. So it's complicated, and I'm not here to say that I have the answers at all, but I am here to say that there are some other things that we need to think about. And one of the things that I like to do for the, Our Black Hair Matters lunchtime chat is to give, and I repeat, food for thought so that
Yeah,
people can make more informed decisions. And that
yeah,
is why I actually have the template on my website or on my little assets page, because I want people to I think we have the power as consumers to motivate companies to do what we want them to do. And
absolutely.
so I have had, discussions and debates of whether or not, is that information even valuable to the consumer? And for me, I think it is. I want to know, and I consider myself a consumer as well as, someone who's embedded in the cosmetic industry. But I feel it's extremely important for people to be informed, or for those who want to be informed. And if they don't want to be informed, they aren't looking at you. They're not listening to your podcast, and they're not listening or looking at the Our Black Hair Matters lunchtime chat. So it's okay to have the information out there for people who want to know. So that's my 2 cents. And I'm just curious about what you've heard across the pond in terms of the desire to know more.
I think that what's fascinating, certainly from our perspective here, is that people do want to know more. They do want to learn more about how cosmetics are affecting them. What I would say is that, and I made this comment in the last broadcast that we did, is at the end of the day, we're consumers. We have multiple things going on into our lives. Like, we don't necessarily need to be in a perspective where we're like, we need to become a chemist overnight in order to actually understand what we're putting on our bodies. So it means that that information needs to be accessible to the regular consumer who may not necessarily be, as you say, embedded in the cosmetic industry. And the other points that you made around studies not being representative, I think that that's a very, very clear recommendation to people who are involved in the supply chain, in the production, in the new product development process, to actually look at what does testing look like. Again, we touched on this last time. When I'm thinking of testing, I'm thinking about testing that happens at an active ingredients level before you can actually create a bottle of shampoo or body lotion and say, hey, customer A, please try this. On both levels, there needs to be representation across all textures, across all skin tones. And also, when you're working with a population of consumers, there also needs to be clear testing. This is something that we provide as part of our B2B platform, where people can actually make sure that they're properly testing things. I was so surprised. I went to an event And I remember speaking to a largish brand, and one of the things that they said to me was that they didn't have access to the right people to test their products on. Now, that's completely crazy. I'm not sure how they're structured internally. However, I do think that in order to create a modern, multicultural, inclusive brand, one actually needs to be testing across the spectrums. It's a non-negotiable in my books in order to actually create a product that we know works, and also from a risk perspective is not endangering any group over the other.
That is why that template exists. Because one of the questions is, has your product been tested on a diverse set of consumers that is representative of the one that I belong in, basically?
Yeah.
That is extremely important. And you're right, it's non-negotiable. And the thing is, the scaremongering, you don't want to go down that path, but you still want people to be aware. And you want to put your money, or at least I do, I want to put my money towards a company or a product that at least is trying. And so even if you're a small business, I'm not thinking that you have the resources that, the big conglomerates have. I'm not expecting that. But I am expecting you to be aware of what needs to be done and having a plan of action in terms of how you're going to get it done. And I don't think that's too much to ask. But as we mentioned earlier, there are some smaller companies that don't even realize that that is something that there is a need for. And until consumers say, this is what I want, then there will continue to be smaller companies who will ignore or not feel that they have the responsibility to get the knowledge to make sure that their products are safe.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that.
So we have the power as
100%.
consumers.
I think we've definitely taken the initiative at different levels of that conversation, be it if one is a retailer aggregating products, if one is someone who's formulating products, if one is on the supply chain side and actually looking at the active ingredients and testing. There are more. That's why when I think about this industry, I often think about what does the 360-degree view look like, right? Where are all the players within this ecosystem, and how can we come together collaboratively to actually make a difference and create the change that we see within the industry as a whole. There are lots to be done, but at the same time, I feel encouraged and excited by all the developments that we're seeing. I mean, certainly over the last 5 years, a lot of things have changed, and I think the future can already look as bright as it can be.
Agreed, agreed. Now, it's one other thing that I want to talk about, and I'm not going deep into Mokra just because I really do need to invite someone who is an expert in regulatory affairs when it comes to cosmetics to dive deep into it, because that is way beyond, as they say, my pay grade. I know that isn't my area, but I need to be aware. But one of the things when it comes to recommended ways of using the product, there is a hair professional that I absolutely love. But one of the things that she oftentimes will complain about is, how come this particular person is using so much product? Does it take all that product? And there are so many videos out there that shows how you saturate the hair with a particular product, and then you layer other products on top of it. And so I understand with a higher degree curl that sometimes when you apply that product and you do have it saturated, and some people would probably say overly saturated with a product that helps to elongate the fibers, that helps the fibers to remain separated so that you don't have the tangling. So it's a plethora of different reasons why you would oversaturate your hair. But I'm not convinced that some of the product testing isn't being done using the amounts that some of the consumers are using. And so when you asked the question about Black products and endocrine disruptors, I mean, we are more likely to be impacted because of the volume of the products that we use. So, not only at one time, but also repeatedly just to control our hair. And so, I, I don't know of anybody who's doing any studies on looking at what I call real life scenarios for us to really understand what threshold it is safe, or is there a concentration or amount that we should be leery of. I don't know.
I think it goes back to the example of the expiry date on that tomato, right? Where are the thresholds? Where are
Yeah.
we safe, and where are we no longer safe? It's
Yeah.
a fascinating thing because, again, when I think about that, I keep thinking about, as consumers, we develop certain behaviors psychologically in response to something. If you're applying a product to your hair and you don't feel like it's being absorbed, or you're not getting any form of feedback in terms of how your hair is reacting to it, the natural reaction is to just put more. It's what I'll do.
Yeah, no, agree wholeheartedly.
You know, if I put a face cream, my skin, for instance, is chronically dry. If I put a product, if I buy a product and I put it on and my skin still feels dry, my natural reaction is to put more on because I want to get a desired effect.
Yeah.
So
Right.
again, I'm often always thinking, if that's happening, if this is the psychology that we have as consumers, what is that actually telling us about the gap?
That's
Because
true.
you often know, again, to contrast it with skincare, when I find that face cream that I put on one application and everything feels moisturized, supple, I'm like, oh my God, that's the one, right? That's the one I can actually apply a pea-sized amount and be like, a pea-sized amount is all I needed. But, but we know that that's not often the case. And I also think that, to your point, in terms of conducting real life studies, sometimes a pea-sized amount is actually not what one needs when you have a big sort of like mass of hair to cover. Maybe you need a little bit more. And this goes into how we are incorporating behaviors, routines, characteristics of multiple consumers in the new product development process, not just in the formulation, but also in the education around the product, right? So I spoke to a brand founder who was explaining to me that actually, when she typically looks at a serum, if that serum tells her, a scalp serum tells her to wash her hair 3 times or like 4 times a week, instantly she knows that nobody who was in the testing process of that serum, maybe for instance, have taken into consideration her afro hair, because actually people with afro hair are just not washing their hair at frequency, full stop.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the communication that a brand utilizes to explain how to use their product is often a clear signal as to whether it's truly inclusive or not. So
Agree.
these are some of the sort of nuances, perhaps, that we see in terms of what's currently in the market and how we as consumers are, of course, behaving and where the gap lies. And often I always say, when we look at the psychology, that tells us a lot. And that's why we're, within our platform, both Cara.co and also Cara.co/labs, which is typically where we partner with brands, we're always thinking about how do we center the voice in all its richness, in all its diversity, in all its nuances, so that from a consumer perspective, we know what it is that we're using, and we're using the right things that are relevant for us. And certainly from a brand and formulates perspective, the products that are being created and added to the top of the funnel are actually the right products in the first place.
Oh, a lot of work needs to be done, but at least we are raising awareness, and hopefully brands who are watching will get some ideas in terms of what they need to do. And also, we wanted to talk about collaboration. That is an area of potential collaboration, to actually work with people who have ideas, who understand the consumer, who have data about the consumer. So I think that that is a good place to end, to let people know people in terms of getting information, brands in terms of who they could collaborate with, and or just stimulate ideas so that we can have products that are all inclusive. So thank you so much for your time. We even went longer this time than the first time, so we definitely needed a part two.
Absolutely.
And so I want to make sure that people know where to find you. And so let us know who you serve and where they should find you.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me on this broadcast the second time around. And thank you to everyone who's joined. If you are a consumer with any type of textured hair and you need personalized support in terms of figuring out your hair care routines and product recommendations, please get in touch with us on Kara.co. Thank you for putting that up. You're so swift with it. I love it. And if you are a hair care brand, a formulator, or even a marketer, and you're looking to learn more about the textured hair consumer, to support your new product development process, to make sure that you're creating products that multicultural consumers like us would love, then please get in touch on kara.co/labs.
Awesome. Thank you. It's great that you exist. You help people there in the UK, but other countries as well. And
Absolutely.
so that is awesome. Awesome. All right. So thank you for your attention. We went a little longer this time, but great information. And so thank you very much, Winnie. And
Thank you.
so just to end, I have a few announcements. So always looking for hair practitioners who are using CBD-based products, or those who want to. And so let's set up a time to chat. And you can go to my hair assets page, links.maininsights.com/info. And then finally, if you know someone who has natural hair and wants to cut it, or maybe it's you, I would love to buy it for research purposes. Please reach out. And the information is also on links.maininsights.com/info. All right. And so as always remember that our Black hair matters. And as always, take care and love your hair. Bye-bye.